8.2 appraisal condition. Is the buyer going to be obtaining a loan? If so, then you are automatically needing to check is conditioned upon the property appraising for at least not less than the purchase price. Sometimes you will have conventional buyers that are willing and able to pay above appraised value. However, that's a case-by-case basis. So typically, if you are doing a contract for a buyer, like I said, that is having a mortgage company involved, they are not going to allow that buyer to pay more than appraised price. So oftentimes you will see 8.2 checked is conditioned upon that appraisal coming in for not less than the purchase price. If you do have a cash buyer, you will certainly more than likely see it checked is not, because that buyer is paying cash and they don't have to verify. To them, value is in the eyes of the beholder. So sometimes they are willing to just proceed at whatever value they deem necessary. They do have a right to cancel if it does not come in for less than the purchase price. So if it comes in at even $100 less, they technically can cancel, even if they're past their due diligence deadline. If they did mark is conditioned upon that. If they fail to cancel for that appraisal coming in lower by the appraisal financing and appraisal deadline, they are again deeming to have waived that condition and their earnest money will become non-refundable. Financing condition 8.3, is financing being required? Do they have to get a loan and financing for any portion of the purchase price? If not, then you will check A. If they are getting a loan, even if it's for only $500, then you will check B, which means financing is required, which states the buyer's obligation to purchase the property is conditioned upon the buyer obtaining the loan to pay for the home, and that the buyer agrees to work diligently and in good faith to obtain that loan. Obviously, as you guys know, financing is somewhat of peeling back an onion in the beginning. Even when they pre-qualify a client, they are only looking at it from the surface level, and as documents get provided and they dig deeper, a lot of times that then makes them have to look into other things and require even more documentation. So set the right expectations for your clients. We're going to say that over and over again because you're focusing on the experience and the feeling you're providing them. And when you set the right expectations, they will expect it and not have it come as a surprise or be considered a hiccup or a hassle. So if they do have financing required, then 8.3 BI and 2, they do have a right to cancel before or after their financing and appraisal deadline. On number 1, it states on here if they cancel the REPC by giving written notice. Of course, you're never going to do anything verbal, so it does need to be in writing. There is a cancellation form in your MLS documents for you to fill out. Then it states if they do that before but not after the financing and appraisal deadline, how much of their earnest money are they willing to still give the seller without any further written authorization from the buyer, and no further written authorization from the seller either. So a lot of times we will put in here possibly half of the earnest money because you're already halfway through the transaction. That seller has already taken their home off the market, probably by now at least 2 weeks. More than likely you're getting close to 3 weeks, which is obviously a lot of time to not have your home out there and marketed to other buyers. So sometimes you'll see half of the earnest money in that section. If you're stating 0, it means that they are still going to cancel, and then the buyer will retain all of their earnest money, and they have every right to do so. So you can see on here we did put 0 for this specific offer, but sometimes you'll see a portion or all of the earnest money still going to the seller. Obviously, if you want to make your offer look stronger for that seller, you will put a portion of it in there, if not all. If you're canceling after the financing and appraisal deadline, so read this very clearly, because the buyer does have a right to cancel after the financing and appraisal deadline, and it does not mean that they're in default. So if after expiration of the financing and appraisal deadline, referenced in section 24C, buyer fails to obtain the loan, meaning that the proceeds of the loan have not been delivered, by the lender to the title company as required, then the buyer shall not be obligated to purchase the property, and buyer or seller may cancel the contract, providing written notice to the other party. Whoa, a lot of people obviously overlook this one, and I would honestly circle it, highlight it, and point it out when you are especially presenting any offers to your seller to let them know that is an option. And again, what if it comes up, then what happens? So you'll look at number 3, earnest money deposits released to the seller. If the REPC is canceled after the financing appraisal deadline, the buyer agrees that all of their earnest money or deposits shall be released to the seller. Seller agrees to accept it as seller's exclusive remedy, meaning they don't have any other options but to accept the earnest money deposit, hence why it's really good to point out not only is earnest money deposit like a security deposit on the transaction, but if the buyer really did cancel last minute at the 12th hour because they weren't able to get financing, that is the seller's only liquidated damages that they can account for. So say, for example, if they have more earnest money that now they're possibly going to lose on their purchase, or they have signed a lease and put non-refundable earnest money down on that lease, whatever it is, they are out all of that money, and the only money they get from their buyer is the earnest money amount. So that's why it's really important to put their money where their mouth is and really try to come up with a decent amount of earnest money deposit, which is good for the buyer to have more skin in the game, in my opinion, because then they will take the process that much more serious. But then it's obviously a reasonable estimate of seller's damages in the buyer's good faith, that if that really does happen and they really weren't able to obtain a loan, then obviously that goes to them as liquidated damages. Additional earnest money deposit on 8.4. Say, for example, you have a buyer that doesn't want to put down as much as the seller ideally would want. Well, after their due diligence deadline, meaning after inspections and going through and making sure it's the right home for them, say they've gotten another paycheck or they just feel that much more confident in the home and the transaction, they can go ahead and put additional earnest money deposit down. So that's in addition to their original amount. So again, that will become non-refundable after your financing and appraisal deadline. So just make sure that your clients are comfortable risking it all upon your financing and appraisal deadline. One thing I want to point out is a lot of people talk about financing and appraisal like it's one thing. Technically, as you can see, it's two different things. The deal could fall apart strictly based on the appraisal. Maybe the home isn't coming in at the purchase price, buyer's not willing or able to pay more than the appraised value, and the seller has to have X amount in order to make the move worth it. Well, it can fall apart just based on appraisal. The buyer could be totally fine, still getting a loan for that amount and all of that, to where it's not really based on financing, but it really is based on the appraisal. Or the opposite could be true. You could get through appraisal, it appraises just fine, and then something happens with the financing. Obviously, working with a lender that is very well detail oriented and proactive with this process will make the process for everybody that much smoother. But again, it's our job as agents to babysit everybody and bring everybody together on the same page and making sure that everything is getting done and everything does look positive, and handle any hiccups before they become a bigger deal, because obviously the more you push it off and don't really address things in the beginning, as things get closer to closing, now you're passing your financing appraisal deadline. The seller, who knows what their obligations are when they're moving forward, and it's just, you never want things to fall apart or, come to light in not a good way at the 12th hour. So definitely be proactive. Also, one thing that you need to remember with appraisals is FHA and VA appraisals right now currently do stick with the property for 6 months after that appraisal is done. So if an appraisal comes in less than the purchase price, that seller, if they ever have another FHA and VA buyer going to purchase the home within that 6 months, then that appraisal will transfer from the old lender to the new lender, and they have to honor that value. So the only way around that is if you were to get a conventional buyer, because then a whole new appraisal will be done. Also, if you have a conventional buyer and the appraisal comes in less, you can switch lenders and order another appraisal. We've actually had that happen, and it's kind of crazy. If you even read the reports, they say, this is an opinion of value. Well, every appraiser's opinion may vary, and sometimes it's a lot. I've seen them as big as $30,000 to $50,000 skewed between two appraisals. So sometimes if the buyer really wants it, they really see the value, and somehow the appraiser that was doing it initially was being very conservative, sometimes it's kind of in your buyer's best interest and maybe even your sellers to extend settlement deadline to allow them to switch lenders to get a new appraisal done. So that's a little tip for you, definitely, that you want to have in your tool bag. Section 9 talks about any addendas. So adding to the real estate purchase contract, meaning at the bottom here, once you get to page 6 of 6, that's really not the entire thing, the entire contract, if they state that there are addendums to the real estate purchase contract containing additional terms. If anything addressed in an addendum changes anything, any of the verbiage along here, just know that the addendum supersedes the real estate purchase contract. So if there are, what is it? Is it an addendum number 1? Is it a seller financing addendum? Is it an FHA loan addendum? And a lot of people will get confused and do an FHA addendum and count that as addendum number 1. Well, technically it's not counted as a number. It's called an FHA VA loan addendum. And any addendum thereafter will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Also, you sometimes may have other documentation that you want to be a part of the real estate purchase contract, so you may check other. Some other things that I typically will put in this other line would be a for sale by owner agreement stating, hey, if you accept this real estate purchase contract, then you need to obviously pay commissions with it. So this is all combined together. Sometimes you will have an unrepresented buyer disclosure, which I like to put in here. So that way, when you're representing and presenting the whole offer all together, they have all the different pieces that come into play. Section 10 is your home warranty plan and as-is condition of property. So it does state on here that the buyer or seller may issue and order a home warranty. I actually just heard today a really interesting acronym for home warranties and what they cover, and they said PEACH. PEACH. So P for plumbing, E for electrical, A for appliances, C obviously for cooling, and H for heating. So how I typically explain it to clients is that it's going to cover most, and again you want to emphasize most, of the systems in the home for the first year. So anything that pretty much is powered by electricity that's running in the home, most of that will be included. I think plumbing and electrical, it's very few and far between. Yes, they cover some, and every home warranty company is different. So make sure that you're thoroughly reading what is covered for your clients and knowing the differences. I highly suggest, even for my sellers, to pay for and have a home warranty in place for the buyer, just to give them that really good reassurance that while that first year and they're getting to know the home, if anything happens during that time period, obviously the home warranty company will repair or replace it. Sometimes they have limits. Sometimes they're going to more than likely charge a service fee to come out. But still, say for example, your clients move in and a week later something goes out on the fridge. Well, those buyers are going to assume that sellers always had issues and that there's no way that, this just happened when they've only been in the home a week, and they're going to put the blame on the seller. So it's really good for especially for the sellers, just to say, hey, here you go. That way you're not getting calls or being foreseen as lying on your seller's disclosures, because obviously stuff like that really does happen. Some other things too is your sellers can do a home warranty listing plan. So while the home is listed and or under contract, that home warranty is already in place. So say for example, it's early spring and then by the time you are under contract, it's, the heat's gone, the temperature's risen because it's summertime. They go to turn on their AC and all of a sudden something's not working because they haven't used it since last summer. Well, that home warranty cover plan can also cover that for your seller as well. 10.2, condition of property. Buyer acknowledges that they are buying the home as is. So automatically every home sold in the state of Utah is sold as is, meaning that there are no other express or implied warranties of any kind, meaning that the buyers really have to do their due diligence and they have an opportunity to completely inspect and evaluate the condition of the property thoroughly, and they are relying wholly on their own judgment and that of any contractors or inspectors they engaged with to review, evaluate, and inspect the property. So again, that's why it's a buyer's beware state. It's up to the buyers to definitely make sure it's the right home for them by the due diligence deadline, but more importantly, especially by closing. Because once they do close, they are assuming all responsibility of the home as is. The only way they can go back to the seller is if the seller doesn't fulfill their obligations in 10.3, condition of property. Seller acknowledges that they will agree and reference in writing anything that they are aware of about the home. So whether it is a repair, whether it's a remodel, whether it's something that a previous owner did, but they do have knowledge of it, all of that, the seller is stating that we are going to disclose in writing. So say, for example, something happens after the seller's disclosures are already signed. Well, there is a section in the seller's disclosures that has an update section. Make sure if something happens, your seller tells you about it, you do update that seller's disclosures. You then resend that last page over to the buyer to acknowledge that they are aware of that. Then they are also going to make sure that they are going to deliver to the buyer the home in substantially the same general condition as it was on the date of acceptance. So they can't, say, okay, peace out, and start ruining the home and doing anything out of ordinary wear and tear. And then they will also deliver to the property to the buyer in broom clean condition and free of debris. It doesn't mean it's going to be deep cleaned, doesn't mean it's going to be professionally cleaned, doesn't mean they're even going to do anything more than making sure it's broom clean. So a lot of times if it's a really dirty home, you're going to want to do an addendum to say home and or carpets to be professionally cleaned upon seller vacating the home, and making sure that that is paid for by the seller when they leave, if that's important for your buyer. And then just educating your buyer that everybody has their own definition of clean. And so to plan on deep cleaning the home, whether they're getting it professionally cleaned either way, because obviously if it were me and I was moving into a home that was already lived in, you're definitely going to want to make sure that every nook and cranny, especially bathrooms and kitchens, are really deep cleaned so where you don't see any of their remnants still. Also, the seller will repair any moving related damage to the property. So say they're moving out, somebody drops a furniture piece and it knocks a hole in the wall. Well, they can't just leave it and say, well, they've already closed on it, everything's, it's in their name, not my worries. Nope, they actually do have to pay for or have a contractor come out and do that to repair that. On number 11, the final pre-settlement walkthrough inspection. So within 7 calendar days of settlement, the buyer may conduct a walkthrough inspection of the property. Now, this isn't to, ask for more repairs and find more things and all of that. This is just to make sure that, number one, the seller did do repairs as required or as agreed to in the contract, that there isn't anything out of ordinary wear and tear, and if so, you're going to want to address it, making sure that any items that were supposed to be included are still remaining and present on the property. And then it states on here that if they fail to conduct the final walkthrough or to claim that an item is not represented, shall not constitute a waiver by buyer of the right to receive on the date of possession the items as represented. So even if they don't do it, they still can go back to the seller and say, hey, even though everything is funded and recorded, this is still not right and you need to make it right. However, I would highly suggest you don't do that, because as soon as sellers do get funding and recording and they get their money and everything's done, it's going to be pulling teeth a lot of times to get them back out. So again, it's good to be proactive and get this stuff done. If there is anything that comes up during your walkthrough, a lot of times we do it right before settlement, so right before we go to the title company for closing. I will automatically start negotiating that with the agent and saying, hey, we're signing, but we're going to hold up funding and recording until this is corrected. So you're kind of holding that over their head to make sure that it is corrected by that time. We will go over, obviously, the next page in the next recording.